Welcome back to Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes. This video has become personal for me, and I'll try to explain why. When I first started my channel, I was making a list of people, places, and things that I wanted to do videos about. As I would come across something that I found interesting, I would add it to my list. One day my mother told me not to forget Ernie Pyle. I needed to be sure to do a video on him. I told her if he wasn't on my list, I would make sure to add his name. I'll admit that I didn't know much about Ernie Pyle at the time. I knew that he came from a small town in Indiana and that he was a newspaper reporter. That was about it. Once I started learning about the man, Ernie Pyle, I understood why my mom wanted to be sure that he would be included in my videos. There are a few questions I would love to ask my mother, but sadly, because I didn't do one when she suggested it, it's too late. But I really believe that I know why my mom wanted me to talk about the man from Indiana, Ernie Pyle. She was a schoolgirl during World War II, so she was old enough to have memories of that time. Mom's Uncle William, her mother's baby brother, was fighting in Europe, a soldier of the 4th Armored Division. I truly believe that my grandmother, along with her parents and siblings, prayed every day for William's safe return from the war. I'm sure my family was included in the millions of Americans who read Ernie Pyle's much-loved newspaper columns. He told America about the common soldier. He would write about how long it had been since he had eaten a hot meal. Did they have days and days of unending rain and had to walk through mud up to their ankles? Were they freezing? How long did they go with little to no sleep? So basically, what the American soldier had to endure day in and day out. He brought the war home to millions of Americans with his words, descriptions, and his love for the American soldier. I have no doubt that Ernie Pyle touched my family in ways that I never knew until now. I am happy to say, even though my great-uncle had been wounded and had been awarded the Purple Heart, he was one of the lucky ones. He made it back home. William Pyle married Maria Taylor in 1899. Will was a tenant farmer on the Sam Elder farm just outside of the city of Dana. Ernest Taylor Pyle was born on August 3, 1900. His mother had just turned 30 a few weeks earlier, and in those days, most women had their first child well before the age of 30. The family was worried about Maria. Her older sister Mary was there to help. When the doctor pulled up to the house in his horse and buggy, Maria still hadn't had the baby. The doctor went in and I'm sure took charge of the situation, and sometime later, Ernest Taylor Pyle would enter the world. Mary would stay on to help her sister with the house and the baby. Will knew that he would never get ahead working as a tenant farmer. So after he fulfilled his obligation to Sam Elder, Will would leave the home on the Elder farm and move the family into the farmhouse of Maria and Mary's father, Lambert Taylor. There was a brother John who was married in September of 1900, and he had moved out of the Taylor home. Aunt Mary would marry George Bales in 1908, and she too would move out of the Taylor house. With the passing of Maria's father in 1911, that would leave the Pyle family as the only ones living in the home. It would be Will and Maria's home for the rest of their lives. Farm life is not an easy one, and especially back in the early 1900s. Farm families were always there to help each other when needed. If a family was in need, you can be assured that Will and Maria, along with Ernie, would be there to help out a neighbor. Ernie would learn compassion, thoughtfulness, and kindness growing up in this farm community. The year Ernie turned 13, he was old enough for his first paying job, making 50 cents a day, helping with the farmers during harvest time. The farmers would all gather at one farm and help that farmer with his harvest. When that farm was finished, they would move on to the next farm. Ernie's job was as a water boy. It was his job to fill up water jugs with cool water and take it out to the farmers as they were working in the fields. He was to make sure that there was always cool water for them to drink. While the hard work of harvesting was going on, the wives would gather at the home of the harvesting farm and help make a huge meal for the men to enjoy at noontime. If it wasn't a table fit for a king, it was definitely a table fit for hard-working, hot, and hungry farmers. America entered World War I in 1917. High school boys from Dana were enlisting in the military. Ernie wanted to enlist before graduation, but his parents insisted that he graduate first and get his diploma. Ernie did as his parents wished and stayed home and graduated in 1918. After graduation, he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Preliminary training was at the University of Illinois at Champaign. He was getting ready to head to the Great Lakes Naval Training Station when the war ended on November the 11th, 1918. Since the war ended, he had been put on inactive status with the Navy. So, now, what was he going to do? Farming was not for him. So, Ernie would enroll at Indiana University in Bloomington. Freshmen were not able to take journalism classes at that time, so he would major in economics. But his sophomore year, Ernie started taking his journalism classes. He would work on the student paper, the Indiana Daily Student. He would become the city editor and the news editor. He also worked on the Arbutus, which was the school yearbook. Ernie would also become the senior manager for the IU football team, making him a letterman along with the other members of the team in 1922. As busy as Ernie was during school, he would fall hard for a pretty redhead girl named Harriet. I've read at least 2 different accounts of what happened to their romance. The Indiana University Journalism Department was contacted by the LaPorte Herald, LaPorte, Indiana, and they were asking for a recommendation for a reporter. Ernie would take the position, and he dropped out of school his last semester of his senior year. One story I read was that Harriet had broken up with him, and suffering from a broken heart, he would take this job to get away from IU. Another story is that Harriet broke up with him after he had taken the job and moved to LaPorte. Either way, he would leave IU before graduating to take the job at the LaPorte Herald, and Harriet would break up with him. When he showed up for work, the editors had their first look at Ernie Pyle, and they thought that they had hired a young, bashful, and unimpressive 22-year-old who sure did not look like a newspaper man. But they needed a reporter, so they got him a room at the YMCA and put him to work covering the courthouse, fire and police stations, and City Hall. But they found out that people liked him immediately. This was a chance for him to get experience working for a newspaper in a small town before trying to write for a larger paper in a big city. Not long after Ernie started working for the Herald, an editor with the Scripps-Howard newspaper chain was looking for talent, and he contacted Indiana University. The current editor of the Daily Student was Nelson Poynter, and it just so happened that Poynter was a friend of Ernie's. The Scripps-Howard editor offered Ernie and also Nelson Poynter $30 a week to work for the Washington Daily News. It was an offer neither one of them would refuse. The pair would board a train in May of 1923 and headed to Washington, D.C. With his work, Ernie would show what a good reporter he really was. Eventually, he would be moved to the copy desk. In this position, he would take the words of other reporters and turn them into columns that flowed better and was more in the style that his boss liked. He proved that he was an excellent choice for this position as well. On October 31st, 1923, Anita Hanna, a friend from IU, invited Ernie to a Halloween dinner party. Anita's roommate was Geraldine Siebold's from Minnesota. Geraldine went by the nickname Jerry. Jerry worked for the Civil Service Commission, and Ernie had to leave early that night because he had an assignment. Ernie and Jerry would see each other again nearly a year later. They would be married in July 1925. In the spring of 1926, getting away from it all was uppermost in the minds of the Pyles. Ernie and Jerry would buy a Model T and a tent, quit their jobs, and headed west. They would fall in love with Arizona and New Mexico. By the end of the summer, they would find themselves in New York City and broke. They had to sell the car for $150 just to buy food. Ernie would search for a job, and right away he found a job working on the copy desk of the New York Evening World. After 16 months in New York City, Ernie would receive a letter from his friend Lee Miller, who had become managing editor of the Washington News. The Washington News was shorthanded, and Lee offered Ernie the position of telegraph editor. Ernie was back to work at the Washington News the last week of December 1927. After returning to the Washington News and his old position of telegraph editor, Ernie proved once again what an excellent telegraph editor he was. But Ernie wanted more than this, and he had an idea. After attending the Indy 500, he had fallen in love with race cars and speed, and now he had a growing interest in aviation. He asked Lee if he would allow him to write an aviation column for the paper. Ernie assured Lee that he would still keep up with his editing job, that was his first priority. But he would work on his aviation column on his off hours. Ernie would visit the nearby airports. He made friends with pilots and mechanics. His first aviation column appeared in March of 1928. Ernie would tell weather conditions, talk about who was flying in and out of the airports. He wrote about the different types of aircrafts. He would write about who were passengers and where they were going. He had great admiration for the pilots who risked their lives delivering the mail. His columns would become so popular, he would be taken off the editor's desk and be made aviation editor for all of Scripps-Howard. When a high-ranking editor started to introduce Ernie to Amelia Earhart, the famous aviatrix stopped the editor and said, "Not to know Ernie Pyle is to admit that you yourself are unknown in aviation." After 4 years of writing his aviation column, Ernie was given an offer that he reluctantly accepted. He would become the managing editor, and another reporter would take over his aviation column. His aviation friends had a farewell celebration for Ernie and Jerry. Amelia Earhart gifted Jerry a jewel case and a watch for Ernie. His final aviation column was printed on June 18, 1932. Those wonderful days of writing his aviation column were gone. Now, as managing editor, he had to deal with all the headaches that came with the job. Plus, he didn't have a secretary or even a private office. Now it was dealing with personnel, budgets, and filling in for those who were sick or on vacation. December of 1934, Ernie had a bad case of the flu and he just couldn't get over it. His doctor told him to go to Arizona, someplace warm. Ernie and Jerry headed for what they thought would be a warmer climate, and they were traveling by car. They would find that Arizona in the winter was not warm. Then Ernie and Jerry headed south and found temperatures of 4 degrees above zero. They drove through a blizzard. It seemed like it was either cold and or raining. They finally gave up and decided to sail home from Los Angeles to Philadelphia on the freighter Harpoon. This was a 3-week, 6,000-mile trip. As the Harpoon sailed south, the air grew warmer, finally. These 3 weeks were wonderful. No deadlines to meet, no budgets to worry about. They could do whatever they wanted without a care in the world. They would disembark in Philadelphia, unload their car, and head back home. Ernie would be back to work as managing editor. After returning, a syndicated columnist took a vacation, leaving an opening for another writer's work. Ernie would write 11 articles about his recent trip. They were an instant hit. G.B. Parker, editor-in-chief of the Scripps-Howard newspapers, would say that Ernie's articles had a Mark Twain quality about them. Ernie would convince his superiors to allow him to become a roving reporter. His instructions were to drive wherever he wanted and to write about whatever he wanted to, as long as he would write 6 columns a week and mail them into the paper for distribution to the 24 Scripps-Howard newspapers. The Washington News would print each of his columns, and the other editors had the option to print them if and when they wanted. Ernie and Jerry would begin this next chapter in their lives, August of 1935. Ernie never looked back. Ernie's first article was published on August 8, 1935, from Flemington, New Jersey. Right out of the gate, he found himself in the middle of one of the biggest stories of the century, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Flemington is where the trial was held. He would travel north into Canada. In Callander, Ontario, he would visit the Dion quintuplets. The girls would make, as Ernie called it, personal appearances twice a day to crowds that averaged at least 5,000 visitors, and 3/4 of those were visiting Americans. Ernie and Jerry would travel everywhere, it seems. They would visit not just America, but Canada and Mexico. They also would travel to South America. In his articles, he would refer to Jerry as that girl who rides with me, though there were times that Jerry wasn't with him. Ernie would talk to everyone, from rich to poor, famous to the not famous. He would talk to politicians, and there was a time he visited a 21-year-old girl in jail who was found guilty of killing her father. Basically, he wrote about people and their accomplishments and their struggles and their day-to-day lives. As he kept writing, the more popular he would become. He wrote about his father, telling a funny story that was probably told around Dana, Indiana, for years, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's still retold every once in a while. When Will's brakes started squeaking, he put oil on them. Then he drove into town and ran right over the curb and right through the plate glass window and ended up inside a dry goods store. And he would say about his mother that she would rather drive a team of horses in the field than cook dinner. And also, she had only 3 real interests in her life: her husband, her son, and her farm work. December 1936. Ernie is now going to bring his magic to Hollywood. Let's continue and see which Hollywood celebrity he is going to write about first. Ernie got to spend the day with Clark Gable from breakfast on. At that time, Gable was probably the king of Hollywood. Gable and Indiana-born Carole Lombard were an item. The first thing Ernie tells his readers is that he doesn't know if they are going to get married because he didn't ask him. Ernie figured it was none of his business. He writes that Gable looks exactly the same as he does on the screen and acts the same way. He walks with a big stride. He's always laughing. He made Ernie feel right at home. He had lunch with Ginger Rogers. Ernie would write that he was so nervous about meeting her that he couldn't even sleep the night before. He would spend the day with Frederick March. That day started with Ernie going to the March home. He was to spend the day with Joan Crawford. Crawford was one of his favorite actresses before he even went to Hollywood. She was filming The Last Mrs. Cheney. She didn't have a lot of time to spare, but Ernie writes that at the end of the day, he was still a Joan Crawford man. Ernie has possibly met the king. Now he will meet the princess. He is introduced to Shirley Temple and shakes her hand. Shirley's mother was on the set, and he naturally would spend most of his time with her. But he would write that he was just crazy about that kid. Ernie left Hollywood and flew to Oahu, Hawaii. He asked and received permission to visit the leper colony on the island of Molokai, right off the island of Oahu. He was able to visit for as many days as he wished. There is a mountain that separates the colony from those who live on Molokai. There are 500 people who live there in the colony, including the caregivers. He found instead of an atmosphere of dejection and impending doom, but a rather happy community. They have clubs, play games, have dances, attend cocktail parties, and have movies 3 times a week. It was definitely not what he had expected. These articles from Hawaii were published in February of 1938. Ernie talks about defenses in Hawaii. Obviously, there was concern at this time with world events. Italy has invaded and conquered Ethiopia. Germany and Italy have announced the Rome-Berlin Axis. Japan has invaded China. The world is on shaky ground, and it is about to get worse. No wonder Ernie checks out the defenses in Hawaii, having no idea what is in store for Pearl Harbor in the future. After leaving Hawaii, Ernie returns to California. He would tour the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. He was not at all impressed and called it the nuttiest house in the U.S. He would return to Hollywood, and he would tour the Disney studios not long after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had made its debut on the big screen, and the audiences loved it. But Ernie would find out those at the studios did not. They found what they considered mistakes and things that they could have made better. But I don't think America would have agreed with them one tiny bit. He met makeup artists, stuntmen, producers, directors. He met Norma Shearer and found her to be lovely. She was filming the movie where she portrayed the doomed French queen, Marie Antoinette. Norma would drive Ernie over to where he joined her and the director to watch the rushes from the previous day. He would meet 21-year-old Olivia de Havilland, and he found her to be the most beautiful of all the actresses he met in Hollywood. He would also get a little scuttlebutt about Gone with the Wind. Scarlett O'Hara had not been cast yet, after thousands of women were interested in the role. At the time Ernie was there, word was that Paulette Goddard had gotten the part, but a little birdie told him that she wasn't going to get it. Ernie believed that they knew darned good and well who was going to get the part. They just wanted to keep it a secret. It also sounded like the role of Rhett Butler was between Clark Gable and Ronald Colman, and it was said that Clark Gable wouldn't be able to make the movie because his studio wouldn't release him. Oh, the things we know now that they didn't know then. After leaving Hollywood, Ernie continues with his driving around America and writing his columns. He took a short break in 1940 as per doctor's orders, and his fans wanted to know where he was. As you can see, I have listed some of the horrors that were going on in the world at that time. The evacuation at Dunkirk has already happened. The Battle of Britain was in its beginning stages. England was fighting for its very survival. Americans had to be on pins and needles just waiting, watching and waiting to see what was going to happen next, and if America would enter the war or not. Once Ernie was back to work, he visited Indianapolis. He would get special government permission to visit the Allison airplane engine plant. He would write, "Here within the walls of the Allison plant, you have our present national defense picture all under one roof, its impetus, its urgency, its industrial genius, its terrific difficulties, and at last its accomplishments. Allison today is by far the biggest thing in Indianapolis, and in a sense, one of the really big things in America." The 5-ton tank Ernie writes about was built at the Marmon Harrington Company, and Marmon Harrington was deep in expansion for defensive orders. By 1940, Ernie has become so popular that he has had to hire a secretary to handle his mail. He has fans all over the country. So, when Ernie and Jerry decide to build a house, it will be built in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In 1940, $3,000 would pay for the lot and arrangements with the contractor for a 5-room house. And on October 4th, it was front-page news in the Albuquerque Journal announcing that Ernie Pyle was building his home there. Obviously, they were very proud, thrilled, and excited. In an article published in Clarion Ledger of Jackson, Mississippi, on November 30th, 1940, Ernie would write that he was going to Europe. He would say, "All I know is that a small voice came in the night and said, 'Go.' And when I put it to the boss, he leaned back in his chair and said, 'Go.' And when I sat alone with my so-called conscience and asked it what to do, it pointed its finger and said, 'Go.' So I'm on my way." The first part of his journey was an 8-day crossing of the Atlantic to Lisbon, Portugal. After nearly 2 weeks in Lisbon, Ernie finally gets the call to be at the airport in the morning. He was one of 11 male passengers who were headed to England. What was supposed to be a 10-hour flight ended up taking a little less than 7. Finally, Ernie has arrived. Ernie would arrive in England on December 9th, and his first steps were in a small coastal town. He would have to go through inspection, but he was told that they would do their best to make sure he would catch the train to London. In his column, published on December the 28th, Ernie would write, "I wish you could see that village street. It is exactly like a picture from a Dickens novel. The gabled buildings, the language on the signs, the smoke from the chimneys were all the pure England of fiction, so peaceful, neat, and secure. I had not been there 3 minutes before I was in love with England." He would also write, "Anyway, I know that in all my traveling, I have never visited a new country that in a few short hours filled me with the warmth that I feel for England." The inspectors were as good as their word. Ernie was on the train to London and would arrive the evening of the 9th. The first days in England were basically uneventful, and he feared the readers would find his columns dull. All that changed on the night of December 29th. The German planes came that night. After the sirens went off, he could hear the Germans above. With the black curtains covering the windows, he could feel the shake from the guns. He could hear the bombs, for they were not too far away. Half an hour after the firing started, Ernie gathered a few friends, and they would find a high, darkened balcony which gave them a view of 1/3 of the entire circle of London. Ernie would write that an inner excitement had come over all of them once they were on the balcony. An excitement not of fear or horror, but full of awe. The whole horizon of the city was lined with great fires. They were so close to some fires that the group could hear the crackling flames and the yells of the firemen. The German planes came in waves about every 2 minutes and were dropping incendiary bombs. If those on the ground could get to them quickly enough, they could be smothered by sand, and if not, soon would be seen yellow flames. St. Paul's Cathedral was surrounded by fire, but it would survive. Ernie wrote that later he borrowed a tin hat and went out among the fires. This he also found exciting. He would write that the thing he will always remember above all the other things in his life was the monstrous loveliness of that one single view of London on a holiday night, that it all went together to make the most hateful, most beautiful single scene he had ever known. Ernie wanted to write his overseas columns in the way he wrote his vagabond columns. He wanted to paint pictures of what he was seeing with his words. Ernie would travel all around England, the British Isles, and Scotland. Paisley, Scotland, had the Home Guard, and most of their arms were made in America. Ernie visited an underground shelter where people would be there all night, not leaving until the morning. He was shocked when he saw thousands of people laying down on the concrete floors. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, who also had a daily newspaper column, would write that she read every article written by Ernie Pyle while he was in England. She recommended that everyone should read his column. His articles were loved by all. Maria Pyle passed away on March 1st, 1941. The notice of her death was printed in newspapers all over the country. On the evening of March 3rd, Ernie and a friend were on their way to dinner. Just a few blocks from the hotel, a bellboy would catch up with them and handed Ernie a telegram, which he read immediately. After dinner, and Ernie had returned to his hotel room, he would pull the blackout curtains across the windows, turn off the lights, and the rest of his evening was spent with his mind full of memories and images of his mother. He made it back to the States later in the month. His plans were to spend some time with his father, then some time at his new home in Albuquerque with Jerry, and then back to work, writing his travel column for the Scripps-Howard newspapers. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed part 1 of Ernie Pyle, Hoosier farm boy to Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent. With this video, you were able to see that he had experienced and wrote about some of the most popular happenings of the day before he became the Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. Be sure to click on the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes video is uploaded. Until next time,